and drink. So after this presentation, I'd be happy to have a couple of glasses of wine with you. Thank you very much for coming to presentation IT Data Analytics. I probably have 4 things I need to get out of the way as kind of confessions or apologies. First, I apologize for my Minnesota accent. So you're totally welcome to laugh every single time I say "oh" about, where I sound like a crazy Canadian. So I am originally from Minnesota. I work at Excel Energy. How did I end up here? I met Connie, one of the conference organizers at a SAMS conference when I was here in Columbus last year. And in that training, she noticed that I probably had an opinion about everything, so she said, "Hey, would you be happy to come in and speak at a conference later next year?" And I said, "Sure." And I thought, okay, great, what am I going to talk about? What I wanted to present today is really, even though I work at Excel Energy, I've only been there for about a year, so I'm going to present on basically my last 20 years of experience in the area of IT audit, and how I've been working with different IT organizations and even businesses, the business units, to determine what is it that we need to look at and how do we do that. So since it is the last session of the day, my goal is really easy. All I want to communicate to you is a few different ways to how to look at the data that you already have. What are some unique ways you can do analysis on what you already have and achieve a really high ROI? So we're not talking about any tools. I know that's probably sacrilege at a security conference to not talk about tools. But you really don't need that to use some of the basic analytics that we're going to talk about. So it's a 45-minute session. I can't make you guys experts in the area of data analytics in 45 minutes, but I hope to offer some inspiration. I hope that you'll have some aha moments as you're seeing their video. I can take that back to my organization and look at it that way. And also some information. I have things that inspired me for this presentation and I hope to share those with you. So the first thing I wanted to do is give you a perspective on a problem. And I chose probably the cheesiest analogy I could think of so that it would stick in your head. Basically, we all know who the cobbler is. You probably have guessed by the title of the presentation. He's the IT organization that has all the skills, knowledge, expertise to put together and craft the shoes. The shoes can be anything of value. They're all those insights that you want, the meaning, the deeper, the predictive analytics. And one thing that isn't really stated in the analogy, but we have this business. We have these people up here that our cobbler's actually working for. The whole reason that he's so preoccupied with filling their needs, that he's not actually looking at taking care of his own family. So then we have the shoeless children. The shoeless children are internal processes that don't get the light of day thrown on them by IT. Here's an example. One of the things that IT manages all the time is assets. Your servers, your routers, your switches, your firewalls, those need to be analyzed. How often do you do a physical audit? And if I were to ask you, what is the source of truth for your asset inventory, what would you tell me? Is it the agent-based application that you have that scans? Is it your agent list? That will miss anything that doesn't have the agent based on it. What about your agent list? Well, that's not going to tell you anything that's not connected to your network. What about your financials? What about that business unit that doesn't want to follow IT protocol, goes out and purchases their own servers and sticks them in the broom closet or the bathroom? Your actual source of data is all of it. And the source of truth comes when you do data analytics and you combine them and you see where the discrepancies are, because those are your control failures. Probably the other part of data analytics there would also be your retirement. So how do we know that we purchased this asset and who trace it all the way to when we destroyed that hard drive to make sure that it's not an ongoing risk to the organization? So you can see there's lots of internal processes that we might not do our own analytics on. We might not even think about the different places that it could occur or different sources of truth we have. And that's why we have audit, right? So audit is child protection services coming in my little analogy here and saying, guess what, IT? You can't have these internal processes with no shoes. So that is what we're going to talk a little bit about. And now that ridiculous analogy is in your head for the rest of the day. So I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but I wanted to reflect a little bit as to why this happens. There's been quite a shift in technology in the 20 years since I started doing IT audit, but I would say fundamentally this hasn't changed at all. Since I first started auditing, where we have very sophisticated tools that should be able to gather this information from. What are some of the things about the organization itself that are contributing to the fact that we don't have the time to kind of do some self-reflection? One of the big things that I found is that we've become very big data centric, and a lot of the time, data analytics is on the small data, the criticality assessments, the result of audits, a smaller carved out population than all of the vulnerabilities found throughout the entire organization. We have a focus on big data. Also, what I find in IT is a true affinity for capital spending. If we can get a tool that can solve our problem, we're going to be so much better off than what we were before. But when we focus on the tool and not actually the data that the tool provides us, and if we think the tool is going to fix our business process, we usually end up with a really expensive process that we're going to have to go back and fix. Now, how many people here think that compliance is kind of a necessary evil, is an overhead? PCI compliance doesn't mean that you're really secure. I find that this is actually a very cultural thing in IT. Why do we have that compliance in the first place? Because IT was not doing some very basic things, and so we have to get legislation passed. So now that everybody does it, and now we resist legislation. Because very quickly that legislation gets outdated, and the purpose that it was written for is no longer valid, or less valid than it was when it was passed. The other thing is that when you talk about data analytics, I find that IT goes directly to security event and incident monitoring. Your sys logging, your log monitoring, that's the first place that mine goes. That isn't everything about data analytics. So some things about the customer. I don't really want to dwell on this too much. The only point that I really want to make here is, in the initial analogy, IT owns that structured data. They own the infrastructure. They own the processes. They really support the business unit in that. And what we're finding, along with everything else, that there's a lot of players in the market that are shifting analytics from a centralized business intelligence group out to the business unit itself. If they feel like they are not getting the customer service that they need from IT, they're just going to go out and purchase it themselves. So Gartner says that the power shift in business intelligence and analytics will fuel disruption. And I can summarize that last bullet point on the CIO 21 data analytics trends that will dominate 2016 in one word: Hadoop. That was contained in about 50% of the things that they thought was going to happen in 2016. Now, a little bit about the shoes. I think that we have to, when we use the term, I want to be really clear about what I'm talking about here. I'm talking from an audit perspective. So when I use the term data analytics, I'm primarily using it in the context of data analysis. Data analysis among different data sources. But data analytics to you might be predictive statistical models. It might be the predictive statistical models to get on the offensive side of security. But what I want to show is that this is actually from a staff document, what kind of big data problems we have. That if you're looking in the reactive piece, you're really talking more about business intelligence, the ability to drill down to specific data elements. And when we're talking about proactive, that's really where they can use the term data analytics. So I just wanted to be really specific that what I'm primarily talking about is data analysis, including more in that business intelligence category. And the final observation before I move on is, I know this means it was not meant to be ironic, but obviously shoes come in different sizes and are big. And usually the big data carries very high dollar values. So if we're talking about implementing not just for the storing of the collection and analysis, we're talking some very big dollars to implement tools that can do that type of analysis. Medium, and this is an article I highly recommend. The source and kind of inspiration for this slide actually came from C. Warren Axelrod in the ISACA journal. It is if you are a SISA, you have access to the ISACA journal. If not, let me know, because it's a very good article which shows that you have big, medium, and small, and actually it's the small data that puts the large data into context. With actionable small data, the value of your big data increases. Here would be, or medium. Here's an example. In vulnerability scanning. You can go out there and you can scan all of your servers, you can find all the vulnerabilities, but if you haven't done a host criticality assessment, where do you start? You start on the host with the highest vulnerability score. What if that host just posts like the menu for the cafeteria downstairs? It's not really critical data. What if you have a host that is one of your critical servers that doesn't have quite the extended vulnerability as the other ones have? You don't have that small data, which is actually the categorization of your servers. Your vulnerability scanning gets lost in the mix. So I'm not going to dwell on this one. Instead of talking about it, I'd like to demonstrate it in the examples that I put forward. Now, the one reason that, another reason, despite the fact that IT is too busy to come up, providing support to come up with some data analytics, one of the things that I thought is in my 20 years, I'm not sure that IT really understands how audit functions. Kind of black box auditing. Auditor shows up, says, give me your clearing binders of your business continuity plan, and what are your security policies, and I'd like a data dump, and you just throw them in a conference room with as much information as you can. They'll come back, they'll ask copious, sometimes questions of the people, and then you get a report. And they say, here's the thing that you didn't do very well. Well, how did that auditor get from the scoping memo and what they told you to make documents to their conclusions? Is anybody in here an auditor? Great, I got audit fans here. Alright, so there are some more of us. We're all still from the security conference. Sorry for outing you guys. The thing is that I found that my clients were not very aware of the procedures that are applied. So I will talk about that a little bit later. We're getting a little bit better with frameworks. If you saw on the page, we can all agree as to are we going to use the NIST cybersecurity framework, NIST controls. ISO, what's kind of our criteria? Because I think in the past, businesses, or IT in particular, has felt like the auditor was just making stuff up as they go. That they didn't really have any, you weren't on the same page, and you're asking them, like, how is this even a risk? Where's the risk here? Why are you going down that path? And so frameworks have helped us all kind of get on the same page. So at least if you're having an assessment, an auditor should be able to articulate the framework they're using and which controls. So when I scope an audit and I say, I'm coming in here, I will tell my audit team which NIST controls as which controls I'm going to conclude on, and for what targets, what servers, what subset of my servers, what desktops. What methodology am I going to use? Where am I going to get my data? And if the auditor cannot articulate that to you, you need to push them on. Because if you can remedy these situations at the beginning, you can understand what the auditor's process is, and then get insight into some of the data analytics you can do. Because if you spend the time doing data analytics ahead of time, it will probably take you less time than it will take you to remediate the auditor's side. The other thing is data analytics is an evolving skill set within auditors themselves. My financial counterparts are still struggling with the concept of reference even though they should get the understanding of financial reconciliation, they can't understand the reconciliation of attributes. So we have auditors that this isn't their forte. They're going to still go with tried and true methods like sampling. And then I'm certainly guilty of that, and that's why I've really been focusing on this, which is our reports lack a persuasive story, meaning or context. We usually just kind of you give us a bunch of data, we do a bunch of analysis, here's your report with your finding, and you have no idea what needs to be done, what controls need to be implemented if it's a one-off implementation. So one of the things I've been trying to focus on is making my audit reports much more visual. And I'm not just talking, bar graphs and charts. I actually want to tell a story. And so that's why I think it's really important under the service that the audit profession has now been creating a persuasive story about data analytics. But there is one positive thing that I think that audit has above the other two parts of the organization is that the business unit really knows a lot about themselves. And IT really knows a lot about how to support structured data and queries. However, auditors know the most about cross-business process. Usually a business area doesn't know anything about a transaction, how it comes into their department, and where it goes after it leaves their department. An auditor will know end-to-end generally. That's the scope for their audit. And that's unique. Business areas don't get that exposure. IT generally don't get that exposure. So that is one advantage that audit can really bring to it. Now, audit is trying to bring data analytics more into the work that they do, and so the question is, if you're IT, where can I be prepared for them to ask for this? What areas are they going to use the data that I provide to them? And in most cases, audit is using it for two functions, which is to identify anomalies or to test control. That never makes sense that we do the same, right? So I want to talk a little bit about the black box of testing, to understand a little bit about the auditor's procedures so you can be prepared for the type of data analytics that you do. First, does anybody know what a population is? I mean, it seems pretty straightforward. But can anybody give me a definition of what a population is? If the auditor said, give me the entire population of servers, a population is that area of risk. And you need to know what your auditor's population was. It was all the servers that were Windows 2012. If it was, another example would be if we get the entire HR file, do you care about employees or contractors? Do you care about this control? Both employees or contractors? Do we care about employees only at a certain location? A population is an area of risk. If you don't know what your population is, you can't do your own data analytics. Auditors need to be able to provide that information to you. What might influence your population might be what you're testing. I'm guessing probably most people in here have had some exposure to stocks, in which you'd understand some of the controls testing, but others might also do something called risk-based testing, substandard testing. So this would be the difference between most people have an annual or quarterly access review to make sure all the access to critical applications are complete and accurate, right? We don't want any unauthorized people to be able to have access to the applications. That's a control. That's what you're performing as a business, as IT or a business area. But a risk is if the auditor pulls that same population of individuals with access to that application, and they independently test and say there was no instances of unauthorized access. That's the difference between testing the control and testing the risk. Now, there's one other thing that you should understand when talking with auditors, and that's talking about information provided by clients. Has anybody heard this from either their internal auditors or their external auditors? This is a new term or something you're familiar with. Raise your hand if you're familiar with it. Okay, that's a very important concept, because what this means is when you hand me that list of users with access to the application, I need to confirm that you've given me the complete list. So I might have to do procedures to make sure that that list is complete. I might independently go into the application and say, is there a control number on the number of users that are. That's one example. The other example that I get a lot is, I'm guessing probably the change control. So, all changes made to the application are tested as that's a common control, right? Well, IPE actually takes more to test than that control itself. What we need to do is go to all of our source systems and make sure that we're tracking all those changes and then tie them to the ticketing system. That's how we make sure the ticketing system is complete and accurate. And the reason that I go through the minutiae here is that you have to understand how your auditors are doing these things, and you have to understand why. So when they're doing tests of IPE, they're testing to make sure that the population is complete and accurate. And that's what you need to do before you continue on with data analytics. Now they have two procedures. Well, three sampling procedures to know. And you're probably pretty familiar with this. And why is this a problem? So we have non-statistical sampling, which this is how we usually test controls, and it's based on the frequency. So if you have an annual review, a semi-annual review, a quarterly, or an automated control, you have a sample collection of 1. So that's an annual control, you tested 100% of your population. The semi-annual control, you only tested 50% of the population. And if it's a quarterly control, you only tested 25% of your population. Then we come into something called sampling risk. What's the chance that I select that one sample in one quarter and everything's okay? But really, they mucked up the other 3 quarters. The sampling risk is that the auditor concludes that that control is operating effectively, but really there might be an issue of it. So the question is, you're concluding that something is operating effectively that you're not going to complain about, because nobody wants the, if it's operating effectively, there's no finding, but you have auditors that are basing this conclusion on 25% of the population. Well, just wait, it gets worse. So if it's a monthly control, we test 2. If it's a weekly control, we test 5. If it's a daily control, we test 15. And if it happens many times daily, 25. So you heard Frank. How many people were in Frank's afternoon session? A lot of you. Remember where he said that the federal Medicaid and Medicare fraud was about 4 billion? I was the IT auditor for the state of Minnesota. Our annual budget in expenditures for Medicaid and Medicare was $6 billion. Our calculation on some of that to determine if the Medicaid was appropriately paid from if the Medicare recipient was eligible, thousands and thousands and thousands of transactions with one income tax. Well, just think about that. So, be happy when the auditor tells you that the controls are operating effectively, but if you don't know what their population was, how many types of samples there were, and you don't know what type of samples they took, you might be incorrectly relying on their work. So, there's another example called statistical sampling. For you auditors, I think I know the answer, but for you auditors, how many of you have actually used statistical sampling? Exactly. Nobody uses it. Nobody uses it, but it's a statistical model that says, instead of, what does your sample size, based on the population, what does your sample size need to be so that you can have 90% confidence that this control is operating effectively? How many more sample collections do you need to do in order to make sure 95% sure that your data is operating, that your control is operating effectively? Nobody uses it. It actually takes more time to calculate what the sample size is, pull your sample size, then the cost effectiveness of the additional assurance, which is why nobody does it. So, what I'd like to propose and what I will demonstrate in these 3 case examples of the best alternative. And this is where you should really push your auditors. If they're not, for you that are auditors, take this back with your data analytics ambassadors, which is 100% population analysis. And what that means is, generally, when we do 2 or more sources, we confirm data integrity. Therefore, you don't have to do that IPE that we're talking about. If you take 2 independent sources and you confirm that they match up, that confirms your completeness and accuracy. You didn't have any in one that went to the other, or any in one that went to the other. So you get data integrity, so you don't have to do additional testing to make sure that your initial population is complete and accurate. Remove something called population bias, which is, if I'm an auditor, I will judgmentally select my sample. What if I judgmentally, what if I'm biased in how I come up with my sample, and then reach an inaccurate conclusion? The other thing that it gives us is, when we look at 100% of our population, it gives us a quantifiable measure of effectiveness. So as an auditor, if I do 100% population analysis, I can come to you as business systems. This is what happened. To see a control case, because we took a sample of 25, right? With 1 exception. 2 exceptions, whatever. If you send an IT and you receive those types of findings, and you sit there and you go, okay, well, my control failed. Now what? Thanks IT for finding those, or audit for finding those 2 exceptions. Now, do we have to go through the entire population to find out how many more exceptions there might be? Do we just resolve these 2? What additional action do we have to take? But if you as an auditor had done 100% population analysis, you can say, this control is operating 95% correctly, and here's the 5% exception. All of a sudden, you don't have to do more work. You have to correct the underlying issues that created that 5% exception margin, or the 5% that were not operating effectively. But now instead of an auditor saying the control is operating effectively or the control is not operating effectively, I can tell you exactly to what percent is operating effectively. And there's a lot of value in that. There's no rework. There's no creating a persuasive story. If you look at 100% of the population, you can make a much more persuasive case than what has occurred and create better recommendations. All of these sampling techniques support an auditor's conclusion. They're all perfectly adequate approaches, but I think we could look at those 3 approaches and say the 100% population analysis provides us more value as an institution. So the question is, how do we do that? Well, here's the thing. All this magic that your audit is using, they're not using any magic tools. It's Access and Excel and ACL that only auditors use. I've never seen anybody other than auditors use ACL. Basically, helps you with create those statistical sampling models, does a little bit of data formatting. A lot of people throw something into ACL because it might be easier to format and then go throw it back in classes. They're not using any tools that you don't already have access to. So that's good. Your auditors don't have a leg up, so you can create your data analytics approaches. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a couple examples that I have done over the years and see for some inspiration about 100% population analysis. Now, if you're about ready to fall asleep and you really think you just need that glass of wine right about now, it's been a full day and you don't think I've said anything of value up to this point, and you don't expect that I'm going to have anything of value to say in the next 15 to 20 minutes, just remember this point. If data is valuable enough for you to spend the time to collect it, for the love of God and all that is holy in heaven, do not use a Word document to gather this information. And auditors are the worst offenders of this. We spend all this time getting really good data about things, and we throw them in Word documents, and that knowledge is lost to the company. It's going to languish in the network drive somewhere out there. And furthermore, I actually had a bullet point on here, and I took it off. If you are attaching Word documents, like a Word form, to a ticket in your help desk system, it's usually a root cause of a control failure. It means that you're not collecting the data that's needed to approve that help desk ticket, and I'll give you an example. At Central Energy, we had a project where if we need to provide confidential information to our third parties through a vendor risk assessment program, we ask our vendors a lot of questions before we'll release that data to them. All the data that we receive from that vendor is in a Word document attached to a SharePoint. And then, when it comes to actually collecting the data fields that go out as a part of that contract release, that goes through another ticketing system, and it has a Word document attachment of what fields are being released, how many records in total, contact information, really key information. When I wanted to analyze that process, all that wonderful data that was being tracked and approved on a transaction basis, I couldn't use it to do any additional data analysis. Like, how many vendors are sending Social Security numbers to? The answer might be none. The answer might be some. But that data was collected, gathered, stored in a Word document. And unless we had a specific question about any one vendor, we couldn't use that data to tell us anything more than the value of that single transaction. So if it is important enough to gather it in the first place, for the love of God, do not leave it in a Word document or an Adobe form. Export it to Access. Export it to SQL. Do something with it until you find a way that you can put it in your production environment. So don't gather it and let it languish. So one of the things that I wanted to do to move into some examples of 100% population analysis, they chose job failure. Why? Because when we think of that compliance as a necessary evil, SOX really focuses on job control because it helps protect the integrity of the data that goes through the system. In IT audit, in IT, how many people are in IT operations, IT, the non-auditors? I have a room full of auditors. I'm preaching the choir, man. Okay, so about 50% of you. Has job completion or job failure tracking ever been in your top 10 worries that keep you up at night? Really? You'd be the first person that said that. I actually deliberately chose this because this is the most boring example that I could possibly think of, and if we could get some value out of it, that's what I wanted to demonstrate. It's generally not considered security control, but with some additional data that you can collect as part of it, you can see if maybe an attacker has created a batch job that is used to exfiltrate data that maybe was put in your scheduling software and you didn't know about it. Maybe you could see where jobs are being run out of schedule to see if an attacker is using that to actually gather data. So this is the most boring example I can think of. And I wanted to show you the value that we were using. So just what I will do is I'll explain it, and I'll see if anybody, especially if I've got a room full of auditors, somebody should have insight into the design of this control. First, we have a batch job that extracts job failures from the actual scheduling software. So the software reports if the job was successful or if it was unsuccessful. For batch jobs, it goes through that on a monthly basis before the logs are overwritten again and pulls out the jobs that failed. On a quarterly basis, an employee will select a sample of 25 failed jobs, and then they will log into our ticketing system, and they'll find the ticket that supports the resolution of that job. Then the employee reports the results in a Word document, and then they embed all the system logs to that Word document. Then, they probably save it to their desktop, just in case the auditors ask for it. Then they put it out in their shared drive, because they want to make sure that the supervisors can review it. And then they upload it to the SharePoint so that the auditors can. And then audit, when we go in to test it, we select another sample. And we have to do that on an application by application basis. So can anybody offer up any analysis of what's going on? What are some things we could do to improve based on what we were talking about our 100% population analysis? What are some things we could do to improve this? Very real, in a hypothetical sense, very real process. Anybody have any ideas? How much time do you think it takes to do that? Right. To search through the data for the ticket. When we have 13 applications in our case, it takes 2 to 3 hours per quarter. Sometimes more, sometimes less. Somewhere between 2 to 3 hours. Then audit needs to come in, and then we do our analysis. This is my revised approach. So in our analysis, here's what my analysis of that situation was when I stepped into testing this process for the first time. How many jobs ran successfully? This has always been my question to the auditors, is why is your population only a failed job? The control is actually that the job runs. If the job runs and completes successfully, then it's still properly monitored. Why do you only focus on the failures? So how do we know how many jobs are actually run? And what percentage of our jobs actually fail? Is this a problem? Do we know this? Nobody knows the answer. It only applies for our software applications. And if you think about jobs, a lot of them are interfaces for data integrity purposes. We're a utilities company. Financial applications are actually not our most critical applications. So why are we applying something to only our financial applications, but we're not applying to other applications that we care about data integrity on? It's a manual process. Like I said, it took 2 to 3 hours per quarter per app. I mean, multiple control owners, because those applications were rolled up to different control owners. And still, at that investment of time, a minimal percentage of our population was being covered. And we had files all over the network. So this is my redesign. I didn't change a thing. I still get the same data files that my control owners were pulling. I use the data prep software to extract the job name, the date that it failed, some attributes like that. Then I just went into my ticketing system. I exported all of the job tickets. There's a field that includes the job name, and I put the two files together and I said, if it's a job failure and it's got a job ticket, it's good. So I've got a job failure and I don't have a ticket, what went wrong? And why in the world would I have a job ticket and no job failure? I can answer all of those questions now for 100% of my population on a monthly basis. One of the other things, has anybody ever used Microsoft data collection? You right-click on a table, it allows you to create essentially an HTML form sent through email, and you can use email to manage the replies. This is what we used here. So for I have a table by application that has the email address of the control owner, so that when I have things that don't match, they get one email. I'm able to set up the fields that are read-only, and they're able to add in an explanation of the exception and whether they agree with the exception or not. There's no, and then that's entered directly into the database table when they process that through Outlook. There's no data processing, there's no data entry, directly into my table, and I can use those reporting. Awesome. Now we don't have a tax attachments on emails. It's all managed to the application. And then we can send a report to our control owners and say, here's how many jobs we had, here's how many failed, here's how many of them were resolved timely, here's how many of them were not resolved timely. Is that valuable information? I mean, it's as valuable as job processing information can possibly be, but it's definitely more than what we had before. Sure. We had a policy. So for each ticket, if a job failed, it had to be resolved within 48 hours. So that was our time. So that was the initial value. The entire redesign cost about essentially the cost of the data software, which is about $2,000 for my license. It took me about 40 hours to format input files to those 13 applications. We have 100% population coverage for our stop house. We have 100% exception coverage. So anything that didn't match, we have coverage over that. We have the context of the success, failures, and exceptions. We corrected some data quality issues when I created that joint. We found that our operations people weren't entering their tickets correctly. So we did some retraining and made sure that they did some things that helped create that relationship more closely. So we have less things falling out. And then we had a centralized file storage. So when external audit comes in here and they want to have all their results of this task, I can hand it over to them. There's no population bias now. So there's no, when they can rely on our work more, it's totally independent. It's totally done by the model is totally done by the system. Right now it sits with me. I'm actively looking for it to sit somewhere else other than me. But I think that we've been able to increase the frequency of our control from a quarterly control to a monthly control. We've been able to improve our timeliness, and it's taken less time overall. And that was my boring example. How are we going to use this for more data, for more value? Well, one of the things that we're trying to work with our external auditors on is to gather some data about the jobs that support interfaces in particular for data quality. Which of those interfaces contain confidential data? Which of these interfaces contain financial data? And then we can quantify our job failures and say, here's the percentage of our job failures that have a financial impact. Here's the number of our job failures that have a confidentiality impact to our system. We have report integrity, so that if the job is supporting the creation of a report, we can do some tracking on those jobs to make sure that that job control language hasn't changed. And so that gives auditors additional support for the change management function. And we're also getting the criticality of that job. Just because a job fails and all it does is like post a logo out at some place, and we had some really mundane control failures or job failures that resulted in a ticket that didn't have a follow-up. Well, if these non-essential jobs fail, do I really care? And we were testing them before because we didn't have any attribute, we didn't have any data that would differentiate it from another failure. So that's where we're trying to move to get some additional value out of our initial investment for these interfaces. And it's helping us build knowledge. Now nobody has to ask, what does this interface do? What does this job do? Which is always something an auditor has to track down. But we're hoping to use this kind of bigger data that we've accumulated and provide visualization reports rather than just percentages. So we hope to get some more value out of that. Anyone have any questions?
Job fails, your IT personnel have to manually go to your job failure.
Yeah, it's two different things.
It's like you see automatically job failure.
We have some that do that, we have some that cut off. Our ticketing system, and that's the route, we actually have probably 3 ticketing systems. One's in the process of being retired, version 2 are in the process of retiring. That's a good question. We do have that. Any other questions before I go to this? example. This goes to my pleading to not put things in Word documents. And this also goes to my auditors out there that love to put things in Word documents. How can we get more value from that Word document? In our application narratives for Sarbanes-Oxley, each narrative is about 6 to 20 pages long, and it covers the same topic. It's almost like if somebody created an Adobe form and you had to go in there and you had to enter information about it, but it's a Word document. It asks about interfaces, change management, access control, talks about the infrastructure. And while my application narrative identified my business processes, it didn't further indicate which financial statement line items or even footnote disclosures that people relied on that application's data for. So if I have an IT control failure, I can't tie it to a risk of material statement. So on the process side, they have a narrative of the actual process. They identified the financial statement accounts in a Word document. They identified key controls in a Word document. And they might identify the key control or the key reports that are used for the execution of that control. And they might identify information about the interfaces. These were totally standalone documents. Totally standalone documents. One was used by the financial audit team. One was used by the IT audit team. So essentially, if I had a control failure, I'd have no way to tie it. It was that so what question. So what's the risk of material in the statement? So you have this control failure. Which line items are at risk? So what we did, here's my design process. We productionized our application narrative. So we leveraged Sarbanes-Oxley narrative and information that we gathered for Sarbanes-Oxley and said, this should be a part of our normal operations support team knowledge. They should know what interfaces are in the business. Why are we creating specialized documentation just for compliance? This is information we should just generally have. So then what we did is we took out all the pieces of that application narrative that provided no additional value, and we put it back in the document, but everything else was in our change management system. So not just the people that supported, that knew what Sarbanes-Oxley was, but now the people that supported the application, they knew what the interfaces were, they knew what the key reports coming out of that application were. And we were able to eliminate all the overhead that the poor IT people had to do in updating that narrative. It just became a part of the change management process. But they would just look in the change management system to make sure all the documentation of the application is up to date. We eliminated redundancy. It also fostered some knowledge management between the IT team and the IT audit team. So we had less data to maintain. We transformed our unstructured data in that Word document, and we created it, we put it into structured data. So we could run reports of this change management. We didn't have to worry about formatting, it was all the consistent data. So that actually was a benefit to our IT team that they had less to maintain. And we were able to enforce consistency. When you have a Word document, probably in like the 10th year of Sarbanes-Oxley, you started seeing that that they had all intended to kind of start out the same way, and everybody took different tangents, and we were able to support that structure again. And finally, my very last point is that, and then is that vulnerability management is really all the failures. I've seen this many, many times in the state of Minnesota, in small organizations and large organizations. The problem with our vulnerability program is really a lack of data analytics. And what I mean by that is, when we get into vulnerability management, usually there's not a previous vulnerability management program. We just think we need to get a better tool in place. So we spend millions of dollars to get a new tool in place where there's no process report. You turn on the vulnerability scanner, things light up like Christmas trees, and you don't know where to start. You start with the host that has the highest risk score, You start with a critical application, it becomes a data analytics nightmare. How do you know that you're scanning your entire network? Tell me, IT people, how do you have confidence that you're scanning your entire network? Do you ever compare it to your asset inventory? You have? Yay! In a lot of ways, how many times does a network come up and everybody says, oh, that's our test network? It's not connected to anything. And then you run vulnerability scan on some network right now in the history. Vulnerability management at its heart is really data analytics problem. You start running data analytics, you start having to managing these things. Here's vulnerabilities you need to track, but we're not vulnerable to them via the mitigation costs. Here's the ones that are top 10 vulnerabilities on these top 10 devices that we need to manage. We have a real data analytics problem. And I've seen a lot of failures in that because when we started implementing the tool, we didn't have a process. We didn't have underlying data about our network topography. We thought that because automatic updates were turned on all of our Windows servers and we were patching Java and Adobe that were good. You turn on vulnerability management and you almost don't know how to manage the data that comes out of it. And that most organizations will go great to large-scale tools. The Qualys, the Rapid7, the IP360s. Instead of just spend a little time using Nessus, practically free. Be able to identify some of their network topography. Be able to identify their basic assets. Be able to determine what their reporting requirements are. They spend a little time doing some data analytics on a smaller scale tool. They can build the business requirements for a larger scale tool. Because I found that these issues take lots and lots of time to these days. If we just spent a little bit more time building better requirements, and we would have been better in the long run. So, that was it. Basically, what I will leave you with is some tools on data analytics approaches to map your regulatory oversight functions so that you can knock off the most value. If something is a PCI compliance requirement and a SOX requirement, get the value and making sure that that's the most efficient process possible because you will meet multiple needs for that. Leverage and inventory your existing data sources. So in my job redesign process, I didn't have to change any data sources, I didn't have to get any additional data, I didn't have to change my job control language at all. I used what we already had. And then you just basically re-baseline and productionize. So that's what I was saying, as that process as we gather more information about our interfaces, that'll be productionized, that'll be interchanged used in the software. Now you don't have to do it again, and it's not buried in a Word document. So basically, that was everything that you wanted to know about data analytics. If you have not read this book, I absolutely highly recommend it. I have it in this inspiration. It's called Data Driven Security. It's by Jay Jacobs. And Jay is actually works on the Verizon Data Breach Report. And Bob is supports the SANS Security Human. If you have not read this book, I highly recommend it. They cover visualization, they cover scripting, everything. Highly recommended as a script. Does anybody have any questions? I thoroughly overwhelmed you on data analytics. Well, thank you so much for attending. I really appreciate it.